Welcome to Addiction and the Family, Episode 75, Trauma and Addiction. All right, welcome to Addiction and the Family. So in this episode, we're going to talk about a particularly important topic that I almost can't believe that we have not specifically focused on before, and that's trauma. The role that trauma plays in addiction and the role that trauma recovery plays in addiction recovery. And this is going to apply whether you're a family member or somebody who themselves is directly dealing with the addiction. So we're going to jump into all of that, cover a wide range of topics around it after a quick break to hear from one of our sponsors. Addiction in the Family is brought to you in part by Windmill Wellness Ranch, where I happen to work. We are nestled in the beautiful hill country of Texas, and we've been rated as the #1 treatment center in the United States by the Track 9 independent rating system. And that's based on our ability to bring down addiction relapse rates, anxiety, depression, and also increase optimism, increase resilience, increase people's commitment to recovery. When you see the results, that's what counts. Now, we are so confident of our ability to help people that we offer the Windmill Guarantee. The Windmill Guarantee states that if somebody comes to treatment and does all the stuff that we suggest, and then also does all the follow-up that we suggest, and still needs to come back to treatment within 1 year, they can come back at no cost. If you want to find out more about the Windmill Guarantee and everything else that we have to offer, visit windmillwellnessranch.com or call our admissions line. While I've got your attention, we also offer a free family course to anybody. You don't have to have any association with Windmill, but if you want to just get a taste of what we offer for families, sign up for a family course at windmillfamilycourse.com. You'll get weekly emails that'll point you towards podcast episodes, blog posts, videos, all kinds of resources that we offer for families. Because as you can imagine, I'm kind of passionate about family work, and I happen to run the family program at Windmill Wellness Ranch. So if you want to see more about that, go to windmillfamilycourse.com and spread the word. Again, anybody, anywhere who needs what we have to offer is free to sign up for the course and get those resources. All right, welcome back. Let's get into it. So to talk about this topic, and we're probably going to end up talking about this over the course of several episodes, maybe over this year, because there's so much to cover. But we're going to do a little bit of an overview of trauma and its role in addiction and its role in recovery moving forward from here. So here's a few things we're going to look at. First of all, what is trauma? When we talk about that word, maybe it gets thrown around a lot. What are we actually referring to? Second of all, we're going to look and see where does that fit into the picture of addiction, including where addiction itself can be traumatic. And then looking to see what happens when somebody moves into recovery and where does trauma fit into that and where does trauma recovery become part of addiction recovery. So let's jump in. That simple question, what is trauma? There's a number of different definitions, and if you look in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is the big book of what can go wrong in people's thinking and behavior, one of the things that we see is the original definition of trauma that shows up has more to do with things that threaten your life or that you think threaten your life, including also one person watching another person's life be threatened. Now, if we look at that in maybe a little more of a global context for recovery, what I've often seen is that comes down to safety. In other words, if I feel like my safety is being threatened, it may not have to be all the way up on the level of my life is threatened, although as we may see, if you trace the line of dominoes down, if I feel like enough times, even little experiences happen where I feel like I'm not safe, it's easy to start to turn that into maybe my survival is threatened, even though any one incident may not look like a survival threatening event. So if we look at this idea of safety, the idea that things happen and based on those, I feel less safe, then we have a beginning definition for what counts as trauma. And what that highlights also is that trauma does not have to be some big, huge event or obvious thing. Obviously, it can be. Things like abuse, things like car wrecks, things like the loss of a parent, or even divorce within the household. These things can all count as traumatic events that most people would look at and say, yep, that would really affect someone. Amazingly, when I'm talking to our clients, for instance, at Windmill or in my practice, recovery tree counseling outside of Windmill, what I'll often find is clients may downplay traumatic things that have happened to them saying, oh, well, it wasn't that big a deal. You know, my uncle got a little handsy with me, but, it wasn't that big a thing. Or, yeah, I went through this. Yeah, my parents got divorced, but, we all got along pretty well. It wasn't that big a thing. But then if I stop and ask them, would it be okay if that happened to your child? They're like, oh, no, man, I would kill that guy if it happened to my child. And I have to think, well, if it would be a big, terrible event if it happened to someone you love, then it's probably a big, terrible event if it happens to you. It's just that our brain naturally wants to try and find balance and figure out how to get through things. And so as a result, we may tell ourselves, well, it wasn't that bad. And as a result, we may miss how much it's affected us. Now, one of the great researchers around trauma, at least in kind of our modern time, wrote a book called The Body Keeps the Score. And in that book, he points out that sometimes it is those big traumatic events, but sometimes it's also little traumatic events. And some people would say, for instance, there's big T trauma. That would be the car accidents, the abuse, the neglect, things like that. But little T trauma can also be things that happen that don't seem that big, but they stack up. So, for instance, if you find that as a child you feel invalidated on a regular basis, right? You feel discounted. Maybe you're told your feelings aren't that important. And what's funny about that is maybe no one really said those words. Maybe they did, but often they don't come out and say, hey, your feelings aren't important. What happens instead is over time, just things happen where you think, oh, maybe my feelings aren't that important. Another thing happens. Maybe my feelings aren't that important. And those little T moments stack up to build a big T. So if we look at that sort of thing, we can think, okay, so I may not always recognize trauma when it happens, but in looking back, I may be able to figure out, maybe that was kind of traumatic. Now, how could I tell, right? Well, things I would look at would be to say, did I feel less safe after that happened? Now, we don't always, again, recognize that in the moment. So that may take a little bit of forensic work. That could be done through some of the work that gets done, for instance, in 12-step recovery or smart recovery or with a therapist to say, where did I pick some of these ideas up that I'm not safe? Now, one thing about those traumatic events is our brain is naturally set up where we're going to try and explain things to ourselves and figure out, like, kind of what's going on with this. Any situation we go through, our brain is trying to explain it to ourselves in some way, shape, or form to say, why is this happening? What does it mean for me or about me? Things like that. And so when we go through these difficult situations, our brain, especially as kids, may come up with an explanation saying, oh, maybe this is something negative about me as a person. Maybe it tells me that I'm not good enough, for instance. Maybe it tells me that I'm not smart enough or pretty enough or whatever enough. Maybe I just don't count in the world. And on that basis, we may say, okay, maybe I should hide who I am. Maybe I should suppress my feelings. Maybe I should remind myself that I'm not such a good person. And this is where people get into negative self-talk. And as a result, part of our trauma reaction is based on that interpretation of events. It's not necessarily what happens to us, but it's what we tell ourselves about it. We tell ourselves, oh, this means something negative about me. Maybe I should remember that. Maybe I should hold on to it. Maybe I should make it part of the way that I think about myself and the world and how I fit in. And on that basis, my brain's going to try and figure out, what should I prepare for? So for instance, let's say I go through a series of events as a kid and I come to this conclusion that maybe I'm not good enough to be kept around. Maybe I'm easily abandoned. And as a little kid, remember, abandonment would mean death. So this actually feels like a life-threatening event, even though from the outside, it may not look like a big deal. As a kid, on the inside, it feels like a big deal. So as a result of that, I would have to recognize, wait, when these things happened, I started telling myself, I'm not important enough to be kept around. And then I got to look out for where that stacked up over time. So now what does this have to do with addiction? Well, here's something to check out. Keeping those feelings suppressed, carrying those negative beliefs about myself, that's going to feel pretty bad. In fact, I recently read research that was fascinating for me because it was just based on a post I saw on social media, and I was a little skeptical. Thought, this post says, hey, negative self-talk kicks up the same kind of reaction in our brain and our body as if we were being attacked by a predator. I thought, that sounds a little extreme, but let's look it up. So I started looking up some peer-reviewed studies, scientific research that generally has been reviewed by other scientists and that has a pretty good chance of being pretty accurate. And what I found is that, in fact, cortisol, one of the major stress hormones that we carry in our body that really gets kicked up when we go through stressful events, like being attacked by a predator, we do, in fact, get a dose of that when we give ourselves negative self-talk. And it stands to reason that the more negative the self-talk, the more often we say it, the more cortisol we have going on in our body. And the thing about that is cortisol starts to affect how my system runs, my heartbeat, my breathing, the function of my organs, especially digestive system, that can really get affected by that kind of stress. So now imagine somebody's carrying that belief, that negative thought about themselves, and what they find is they keep giving themselves negative self-talk, they keep experiencing that cortisol reaction in their body, they keep feeling stressed. At some point, they're going to want relief. I want to get away from that. Now, you would think the easy, obvious relief would be stop giving yourself the negative self-talk. But it's not that easy. Because remember, I started telling myself that because the things that happened, the way I interpreted those things made me think maybe this negative self-talk is going to keep me safe. Maybe if I remember that I'm abandonable, then maybe I'll change the way I show up in the world so people don't abandon me so easily. Maybe I'll become a people pleaser. Maybe I'll become super attractive. Or maybe I will stay quiet so that nobody figures out enough about me. Maybe I won't really let people in. But again, not being myself is going to feel uncomfortable. But I'm not going to easily let it go either. So here's where this all starts to add up. You can probably see it coming, right? So here I am. I'm carrying this trauma reaction. I'm telling myself these negative things. My body is feeling stressed. And I may take for granted this is just how it feels to be me. But on some level, I'm going to understand this doesn't feel right. And I want relief from that feeling. Now, for a certain percentage of the population, we also have genetics involved. If you go back and listen to our episode on addiction of the brain, about 50% of this deal is genetic. And so here I am. I have genetics that already make me more vulnerable to addiction. I want that sense of relief. It may not be a conscious thought, but subconsciously, it's definitely running the background. I could feel better than this. Probably at some point in my life, maybe really, really small, I did feel better than this. So what can I do? Well, somebody may say, smoke this, drink this, try that. Maybe I look at pornography for the first time, or I gamble for the first time, or I try any drug, including alcohol, for the first time, and I feel relief. And maybe for the first time in years or even decades, I feel okay. Now, it doesn't matter at that point, especially if I'm, say, an adolescent, when most people start into addiction. If somebody says, oh, no, that's only for the adults, or you shouldn't do that, or this is bad for you, I don't care. I just felt relief. I felt relief from my trauma reactions. So as a result, that addictive behavior, including using substances or some kind of behavior to get relief, becomes very attractive. So I'm often running. Now, would you say it's completely because of the trauma? I do know some therapists who would say addiction is absolutely a trauma reaction every single time. I don't know that I can prove that, but I can absolutely say it is a big piece of the picture most of the time. In fact, out of the clients that I have worked with over almost 20 years working in the addiction recovery field, pretty much everybody turns out to have some kind of trauma. Now, here's the thing to check out, and I may have said this on the podcast before, but I'm going to put it in perspective now with what we're talking about, is to recognize that even if you had zero trauma, spotless childhood, nothing went wrong, unusual, but let's say that happened for you, going through the addiction itself is going to be traumatic. Because in the course of the addiction, you're probably going to give yourself negative self-talk. Everybody I've ever met who's trying to get better from an addiction at some point told themselves, man, I need to stop this. What does this mean about me? What does it mean about me that I'm lying to people that I love, that I'm going against my values, that I'm doing things that I promised myself I'd stop doing? What does it say about me that I spent all this money? All of these things, they're really going to get us to question ourselves. That's going to feel unsafe. And it's one thing to say, I'm not safe from those people out there. It's another thing to say, man, I'm not safe from my parents or society or whatever. And those things may even be true in some cases. But it's a whole other thing to say, I'm not safe from me. I'm the person that I can't trust. That's going to feel really dangerous. And so now we get caught in this loop because I feel unsafe because of my own actions. And then I go do them again, which makes me even less safe. And I do them again partly to get away from the discomfort that I felt because I don't feel safe. That's really a conundrum, right? I am the one making myself feel unsafe. My solution is to do the thing that made me feel unsafe in the first place, but my brain doesn't have any better ideas. And when it comes down to it, I know some people say, well, why didn't you just stop? And God bless those people that can just stop. That's partly where the genetics come in. Because remember, 50% genetic. Some people can't just stop because they decided to stop. They may be extremely vulnerable to, say, opiates, or stimulants, or gambling, or food addiction. Any of those things. They may find that when they go to stop, that circuitry, that reward system, and that stress system are so strong in their particular brain, just the way they're set up, they could tell themselves all day long they're going to stop. And it's just not going to happen. Not by themselves. Now, about a third of people can stop by themselves, They'll just say, you know what, I'm done with the demon alcohol. Boom. They never touch it again. But here's the thing, that doesn't make the trauma go away. They may stop adding to the pile, but it hasn't made the earlier stuff go away, which means a certain number of people who quit on their own without any help or without doing any real recovery underlying work are going to find that, in fact, they can stay sober, but they're sober and miserable. Now, I tend to think that sober and miserable is probably not going to last as long, but even if it does, I don't want anybody to live sober and miserable. Sober and miserable is like never the mission at this end. I want people to learn how to be happy and joyous and free. So to do that, we're probably going to have to deal with some of that trauma. And before we take a break, let's look at one other big thing around trauma and addiction and families. Okay, so we looked at how trauma happens all by itself. We've looked at how it fits in with addiction. Let's now look and see how it fits in with families and addiction. So here's the thing. Trauma reactions can be carried on for generations and perpetuated if we don't do something about them. Here's how that happens. Let's say your great-great-grandparents went through something really terrible, maybe war, famine, heartbreak in large scale, lost several family members over one winter. It's really hard to go through those things and not take it personally on some level. People might ask, why me? What happened? What could I have done differently? It's the most natural trauma reaction of the world to think, what could I have done differently? Partly so we can plan and make sure it doesn't happen again. Even though logically we may know it's very unlikely that that kind of thing would happen again, our subconscious, our deeper emotional mind may not think on that scale. It may just think, uh-oh, I need to make sure I don't go through that pain again. I don't go through that kind of loss again. What do I need to do? So your great-great-grandparents may have made some decisions about themselves that were a little off. They may have simply decided to shut down emotionally because they didn't have any better ideas. And you know what? For your great-great-grandparents, therapy options may not have been so hot. Recovery groups didn't exist. There wasn't a grief group to go and like do a little counseling with it. So they may have just shut down emotionally. So now, as they raise their kids, they may teach them to shut down emotionally. Even though the original trauma didn't happen to the kids, the parents who went through that trauma, who shut down emotionally, may just pass that along because it's what they know. They're just trying to hold on and get through. Nobody's trying to do any harm to the kids. It's just collateral damage. And those kids grow up and they're shut down emotionally and they teach their kids to shut down emotionally. Sometimes that is kind of blatant. Hey, if you cry, I'll give you something to cry about. All right, young lady, you go in the bathroom, you get cleaned up and you don't come out till you can have a smile on your face. Whatever it is that looks like for them, right? And this just becomes part of the family pattern. Now, if addiction showed up earlier in the family, because remember, genetics, as it often did, then that trauma will also come up. Then families try and figure out, how do I adapt to this? What does it mean about me? What does it say about me? What do I need to do to like get through this? And so as a result, they may also come up with trauma reactions to that, including hide it from the neighbors, don't admit it to myself, pretend like you don't see anything, don't hear, don't think, don't feel. We're all just going to pretend to be okay, make it look good on the outside. Or maybe we're just going to be the biggest mess in town, and that's going to become our family identity. All of these things can become traumatic within themselves, and our trauma reactions, they become self-perpetuating and again, passed down through generations. So as family members around addiction, we have to recognize that when we have a loved one who's going through addiction, that can often feel traumatic for us. If it's our kids, again, we can start to take it personally and think, oh, what did I do wrong? How do I fix this? What are the neighbors going to think? What does it mean about me as a human being, let alone as a parent? All of those kinds of things. Sometimes we recognize the family pattern of addiction and say, okay, it's not going to happen to my kid. And then it does. And we think, oh no, I've failed so badly because I allowed this to happen in my family. And so as a result, again, the addiction itself can be trauma. It can be a response to trauma, even though it wasn't our trauma in the first place. We can start to take it personally as a trauma that we're going through, and then we take on a new trauma reaction. And so when we look at this, we can see how much addiction can compound and amplify already existing trauma reactions and leave us in a pretty bad place. Luckily, that's not the end of the story. So tell you what we're going to do. We're going to take a quick break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about what we can do about all this. Among our sponsors, the most important one is you. We're just so grateful for your support on our mission of helping families find recovery. Here's some ways you can help. If you know anyone who could benefit from our message, encourage them to listen and subscribe. Hit that like button. We are so grateful for all of our subscribers on Patreon. So if you are able to support us in that way, we are so incredibly grateful for you. You can also check out any of my books. We've got Realistic Hope, the Family Survival Guide for Facing Alcoholism and Other Addictions. We have the trilogy based around my book, Mommy's Getting Sober. Those are children's books, which are great to spread that message. And each one of the books also includes a guide on how to talk to kids about addiction. And also have my book, Spirituality for People Who Hate Spirituality. Please tell a friend, spread the word on social media. Let us know what we can do to help. Feel free to reach out to us. We appreciate each and every one of you. We could not do this without you. Okay, welcome back. So we've talked a bunch about trauma and how it can impact individuals and families, how it feeds into addiction. Let's look and see what can be done about it. So one thing that we can look at is that what our brain naturally wants to do is it wants to go into post-traumatic growth. I've talked about that before on this podcast, and I'll probably do a future episode a little bit later this year dedicated strictly to post-traumatic growth. But I'm going to do just a quick little summary first, and that is saying that our brain naturally wants to benefit from the trauma and grow in some way. It's just that when things get overwhelming enough, just like if things get too overwhelming for my skeleton, my bone might break. When trauma gets too overwhelming for my brain, my emotions don't break, but they may reform the way I think about myself and my place in the world and how I feel my emotions, how I deal with my emotions, even if I let myself experience my emotions. All of that can be impacted. And so when we look and see what do we do about this, we just need to recognize partly the scale of the problem. This is a big issue. It's not something to be swept under the rug. It's not something to pretend like it didn't happen, even though often we're very tempted to do those things, and lots of people do. When we get into recovery, every recovery fellowship I know starts with, let's get honest with ourselves. Let's talk about what's really happening and start to work through it. Some people call that processing. We might be processing the trauma, which means we learn to talk about it, but it's not just telling the story. It's about feeling the feelings, recognizing the thought patterns, and then beginning to change all of that. And this is one rookie mistake where sometimes people get caught up. They've gone through a trauma. They may have heard I'm supposed to talk about it, or they may feel compelled to talk about it, but all they do is tell the story over and over again. It's kind of like they get stuck in a loop. Nothing's really happening. Sometimes the people around them get frustrated. Sometimes the people themselves get frustrated. I'm talking about it, but nothing's really changing. What can I do differently? And it turns out that part of what we can do differently is we can start to recognize what thought patterns come out of this trauma. And so for that, I may, with professional help or the help of a sponsor or a smart recovery mentor or a guide in recovery dharma or whatever route you decide to go, you can mix and match and do all of them, is to look and see what thought patterns might I have picked up out of that? What beliefs about myself came out of that? And sometimes it goes the other way around. We recognize the belief and we have to trace it back to the event. Sometimes we start with the event and we work our way up to seeing what the belief is. Whichever direction we go in, we're going to end up with some idea of what are those thought patterns now? So for instance, going back to that idea, if people get to know me, they're going to abandon me. If I can recognize that's happening, whether it's through a fourth step in Alcoholics Anonymous or Al-Anon, whether it's through an ABC in Smart Recovery, whether it's through self-exploration and inquiry and recovery dharma, whatever direction you go with, talking one-on-one with a therapist, that might be a little biased, but I tend to think that works pretty well. And a really great therapist will help you understand what are those thought patterns? What are these things that keep coming up? Now, I will say, when you recognize the belief, it's not always absolutely necessary to know exactly where it came from, what the day, what the date, what the weather was like, all the details. Sometimes we may just say, well, I've always felt that way, which usually actually means I've felt that way since I was about 5, 6 years old, but lots happens before we're 5, 6 years old. In fact, our brain processes trauma a little bit differently when it happens before we're verbal, before we can tell anybody that it happened. The things we go through become very deeply embedded. So it may take a little bit of work and digging to find out what is that belief, but that's going to be a starting point. It's not necessarily finding out what happened to me, but what are those beliefs? Now, once I've figured out those beliefs, then I can start and look and say, okay, what can I do about that? Now, there's not one set answer to that, but there's a lot of options. So for instance, if I'm doing 12-step recovery, that might be in the fourth column of my fourth step, and I'll say, wow, that people-pleasing sure comes up a lot. Turns out that comes out of a belief or a fear that I'm not good enough. So I need to always be people-pleasing so that I can escape the fact that I'm not good enough. So let's say I find that out. What can I do? Well, once I've discovered it again, I can allow myself to feel the feelings. This is going to be an important thing to do, to sit down and say, let me allow myself to experience the emotions. Now, if one of my trauma reactions and maybe even family patterns is don't let yourself feel the feelings and don't let them show, this may be a tough road all by itself. Again, where we recommend getting help. So whether that's at recovery meetings, whether that's in group therapy, whether it's in individual therapy, whatever way you go, deep meditation all by yourself, prayer and spiritual practice, however you go about it, allow yourself the space to experience the emotions. For those that aren't terribly good at that, which would generally be a trauma reaction within itself, here's a hint. You can stop and notice, what does it feel like in your body when you think about some of these beliefs or think about some of the events that may have inspired them? You may notice, for instance, what happens around my eyes, my jaw, my throat, my heart, my belly. And notice especially like, oh, my chest gets a little bit tighter. That's a sign of fear or anxiety. I may notice my head flushing and wanting to look down. That could be shame. My throat might tighten up. That would be fear. Noticing just different reactions. If you're not sure, hey, I can feel what I feel, but I'm not sure what it means, think about other times in your life when you felt something similar. You may recognize, okay, certain emotions are happening. Sometimes it's helpful to just say it out loud. Just say, I'm feeling sad right now. I feel sad when I think about this thing. Another technique that I often encourage some of my clients to do is to just put one hand or sometimes even both hands where you feel it. Notice I'm putting them here over my heart area because there's a lot of times where that's going to be the emotional center. We've known this for much of human history. There's a lot of emotion centered around your heart area. So being able to breathe, just allow yourself to feel whatever it is that you feel. As bonus material, once you've started feeling it and allow yourself to feel it, put your hands over it. You may also say, like you're saying it to that part of yourself, I love you. It's okay to feel this. And allow those feelings to come up. Now, feelings are a full body experience, so we may feel them anywhere from the top of our head down to the tips of our toes. Just allow yourself to experience whatever you experience around it. So we've discovered and identified a belief. We allowed ourselves to feel some of the feelings. Now what? Well, there's a lot of therapeutic techniques to work around this. Cognitive behavior therapy, which is more or less the basis of smart recovery, is one way to go where we start saying, okay, I tell myself these negative things all the time. Let me take some time and tell myself positive things. And some of the best affirmations, telling yourself positive things, is when we identify negative belief and we tell ourselves the opposite. We may recognize that subconsciously I'm telling myself the negative belief over and over and over again. So I may need to tell myself the positive thing over and over and over again. And sometimes affirmations get a bad rap in the general public because they think, oh man, I put these sticky notes on my mirror and I'm just telling myself I'm a good person. Well, what's that supposed to do? Pat myself on the back. But as that social media post that I referenced earlier talked about, since we know that negative self-talk is actually something that can impact us physically and psychologically on a deep and pretty serious level, positive self-talk could be characterized as healthcare. It's just as good as working out at the gym, eating healthy, going for a walk. Telling yourself positive things is actually important for your physical and mental health. I have a friend, got one of those little clicker counter type things, and he'd been told, tell yourself positive things, whatever, 25 times a day, 50 times a day. So he decided, I'm going to go for 100 a day. So he would click every time he would tell himself one of these positive affirmations. And what do you know? He said after a little while, he started to notice, I'm feeling better. Pretty simple technique, but there's a lot of good scientific research to show that it works. Now, other things you can do. You can do techniques like deeper trauma processing techniques like EMDR, internal family systems, or IFS, that type of therapy. There's a lot of different therapeutic techniques, ART. It seems like there's almost something coming out every week with T at the end of it, which is some way to deal with trauma because we recognize as therapists how important this is. Now, if you're just going 12-step recovery and saying, that's what I'm doing, this is the way and the only way, not doing any of that therapy stuff, well, then you'd be taking more of a spiritual approach. So you might say, okay, I recognize that I carry this fear that I have to please people all the time. I recognize I carry this fear that I'm not good enough. I might think, does my higher power see me that way? By the way, if you think that your higher power thinks you're not good enough, it might be time for an upgrade, at least upgrading your understanding of your higher power, because I personally want a higher power that thinks I'm good enough, affirms that for me, and lifts me up, not one that pushes me down. So another thing in 12-step recovery is once we've discovered these things in step 4, we talk about them in step 5 to ourselves and our higher power, and then we take those things to our higher power in step 6 and 7 and say, you know what? I'm going to take these and lay things at your feet. I'm going to give you my fears. I'm going to give you my trauma reactions. You may not have used that word. And it doesn't say trauma reaction in the steps, but an awful lot of what they talk about with character defects and that sort of thing, that's exactly what they're describing. We're talking about trauma reactions. So I'm going to take these things, I'm going to take them to my higher power, say, here, I can't handle these things. Obviously, they show up all over the place in my life, more than I ever realized. I'm giving this to you. Why don't you show me what you want me to do next? And one cool thing in that, steps 8 and 9, what follows after that, is where you're writing a list of people that you've harmed and trying to make amends, trying to make things better. Put yourself on the list. Recognize that through these reactions, I have harmed myself immensely, probably also harmed some of the people around me with this. So me taking better care of my psychology, me speaking more kindly and lovingly to myself, me allowing myself to let these old fears and reactions go is actually making amends to myself and everybody around me. If I'm feeling better about myself, I'm simply going to show up as a better citizen of the world and a better member of my family. There's no way around it. Other things you can do, Recovery Dharma would talk about letting go of the attachment to those things, talking about meditation. There's a good emphasis on self-love. Smart Recovery is going to say dispute unhelpful beliefs. Used to be DIBS, dispute irrational beliefs. Now the more modern version is dispute unhelpful belief, DUBS. So being able to do that same thing, which is going to come more or less down to a lot of affirmations, but also recognizing, writing these things down, and making deliberate efforts to counter those things and turn them around. Also doing things that are self-affirming. So not just saying nice things, but doing nice things, not just for yourself, buy yourself a treat or that kind of thing, but actually treating yourself like someone you love. Treating yourself like someone that you want to be kind and gentle with. Treating yourself like someone who can recognize you've been through some stuff. Now, I know as a family member, you may think, great, I just need to get my loved one to do all these things. But here's something we talk about a lot on this podcast. You can't make other people do things. You can't make them see the light. You can't make them go to therapy. You can't make them decide to change. But you can do those things. Recognizing, again, as a family member, you've probably been through some trauma, just watching your loved one. But also, if this does run in the family, which is often the case, you may have taken on old intergenerational trauma reactions, which also deserve to be healed. So you engage in your own recovery, whether that's therapy, one of the recovery fellowships for family members, any of those things. They're going to challenge you to do that same basic work, to look at yourself, to allow yourself to see the patterns, to allow yourself to feel the feelings, and then allow these things to be healed. And recognizing that if you do that, you also will be a benefit to everybody around you. That's a pretty cool deal. All right, so that's a nice overview today of trauma, how it interacts with addiction, and some things that we can do about it. As I said, in later episodes over the course of this year, we'll probably dig a little bit deeper and look at things like post-traumatic growth and maybe look a little more closely at some of those therapeutic techniques. But for today, we'll wrap it up there. I just want to wish you all health and happiness and an ability to let go of some of those trauma reactions in your life. All right, till next time, take care. Thanks for tuning into this episode of Addiction and the Family. This program is recorded, produced, written, floor swept, the whole bit by myself and my wife, Kira. Just so happy to have you with us. If you'd like, you can always look us up on Facebook. We are tweeting on Twitter, whatever they're calling it these days. And we can be found on Instagram. We can be found on Blue Sky. We can be found on Pinterest. So visit caseyauthor.com and just know that we are so appreciative of you and your support. Hit that like and subscribe. Let us know what you think. Feel free to email us anytime at addictionandthefamily@gmail.com. Take care till next time.